All right, so the title here is Learning to Express Reward Prediction Error-like Dopaminergic Activity Requires Plastic Representations of Time. And the people here are previous students that work on it, some of my collaborators, but 90% of the work here was done by Ian Cohn, was my graduate student, and is now a postdoc with Claudia Klopath at Imperial. So keep that in mind, and let's start the talk. So it's now summer, especially here in Houston. So beach and ice cream is kind of like the thing to do. And when my son was young, very small, we used to love going to this beach with him. And as we headed back from the beach, we went through the parking lot. And then one of the first trips to this beach, which we really loved, instead of going straight home, we stopped at this place here, a few miles from the beach, and it was an ice cream shop. And his favorite ice cream at the time was strawberry. And from that time on, whenever we got to the beach, or when we started leaving the beach, there was no chance that we would be able to get home without stopping for ice cream on the way back. So in terms of this, in the psychologist language of this process, this ice cream is what's called an unconditioned stimulus. It's just good. It's not something that symbols something good. It's just objectively a good thing, even if it's not strawberry. And the things that predict that this stimulus will come, for instance, getting to the parking lot, would be called the unconditioned stimulus. So, by the way, I'm going to go through a lot of this, not because it's something you don't know, but it's because actually something you might know too well. So some of the implicit assumptions are going to be lost on you. So, so on the first trip to the beach, when we got to the parking lot, my son was not expecting any reward. And as we traveled through the different places on the way back, on the way to the ice cream shop, he did not expect any reward. But then when we got to the shop, and probably when we stood in line and he saw people leaving with their ice cream cones, he started getting an expectation of reward. He then consumed it, so the expectation dropped down. On subsequent trips to the beach, maybe even the next trip to the beach, once we got to the parking lot, his expectations of reward grew and grew and grew until he got the ice cream, and then the expectations dropped down. So the question is, how do these expectations of reward get learned? Or how is, this is sometimes called value learned. So the standard answer that we all know too well is this temporal difference learning algorithm. And I'll describe it again. Again, you know it, but I'll describe it just to highlight some of the assumptions that go into it. So the first assumption is that there are states. What are these states? So for instance, when we traveled from the beach to the ice cream shop, each location, maybe the visual way it looked on the way, would be a state. So we can discretize and give these state vectors for describing every time during the trip from the beach to the ice cream shop. Or another way of doing it is maybe the place cells fire in a different configuration every point on the way, and these place cell locations, or the place cells, the specific active place cells, are an indication of state. If we talk about machine learning, for instance, then an example, let's say, of a chessboard, every different configuration or every different possible configuration of the chessboard could be a state. By the way, there's a US here as well. So every possible configuration of the chessboard is a state. And sometimes in notation, the previous state is denoted in U, and the next state is U prime. And the goal of temporal difference learning is to learn to associate a value which approximates the expected future rewards with each of these different states. And what is V of U? You know, in a very simple case in a computer, this could be just a table. Sometimes it's too large even in those things to be a table. Think of the number of possible states of the chessboard. But that's not all you're talking about really here. So the normative target of temporal difference learning is to estimate the future, usually discounted reward, which discount is this, so it's the sum of all the rewards I'm going to get now until the end of time, or until the terminal state of this game, and it's discounted. So gamma is a number smaller than 1, and it's discounted such that rewards that come a long time in the future count less than rewards that come in the near future. So of course we don't know the future, so this estimate must be based on past observation. And the way TD does it is very simple. When you enter from the state S to S prime, it updates the value of the state at time S, so that that value of the time of the state at time at state S is V of S plus alpha, small learning rate, times the reward I got at state S prime, plus gamma, which is the small discount value, times my estimate of reward at the next time step S prime, minus my previous estimate at time S. So this is kind of a delta rule. So we can call this delta. And if there is a policy of moving from state S to S prime, a given policy, either deterministic or stochastic, this may converge, in some cases can be proved to converge to the correct value. So it basically updates each state based on just on just the next state, on the value of the next state. So this is delta, or it's also called the reward prediction error, RPE. The difference between my actual reward and my expected reward. So the actual reward will include the S prime and the R, this is the actual reward. And if there is a discrepancy between the value that I get at time S time plus this gamma times Vs prime minus Vs, this will not be 0. When it converges, this term is 0. So this whole procedure can also be thought of as solving the temporal credit assignment problem. So the temporal credit assignment problem means that when we get a reward, many steps after some action we took, which might or might not have been important for getting that reward. So how do we associate an action in the past with getting a reward?
They want leave that place.
One of you has a microphone on, please.
Sit there, local here. Because even without this, it is not comfortable. You know, both.
Excuse me, one of you have a microphone on.
Somebody will be warning you. More than one, leave that place. Yesterday, you fell down here, you poured coffee away. I'm not saying that you can
it's Baba Tope.
Thank God that thing was not hot yesterday.
But Tope, please.
You still came back there again today.
But Tope, please stop talking. Turn off your microphone. Okay. So again, TD could thought of as updating of the solution of the temporal credit assignment problem. Now, note that in the simplest TD, you update each state one at a time. So each whole iteration of this process just allows you to move the value from one state back to the next value. We'll get to it in a second. There are other versions, TD lambda, which can do it faster. This is not the topic of this talk. So does this make sense? So here I'm giving you an example from an old paper by David Foster, Morris, and Dayan, where states are denoted by place field operations, and this animal needs to learn to navigate to a platform. So this is like a Mars water maze that's being simulated. So each state has with it an ability to move in 8 directions, and in the beginning the value function is flat, but as the animal moves and eventually gets to the platform, it updates its value function such that, and it also updates its action so that eventually its actions as well as its value function indicate where the reward is, where the platform is. So eventually the animal can travel directly to the platform rather than going a roundabout way. So in this case, where states are denoted by place field operations, I don't really think there is a fundamental problem with this TD notation, even though it doesn't really agree with the data, which is part of the point of this whole Foster and Dayan paper. But let's go to the most classical experiments that are used as evidence that TD really exists in the brain. The classical experiments are from Wolfram Schultz's lab, and this is taken from a paper by Schultz, Dayan, and Montague from '97. So in those experiments, the animal gets, so those are classical conditioning experiments. The animal hears a tone, and the animal needs to act in order to get, and after a while, it gets unconditioned stimulus, a US, some reward. The animal doesn't really need to do that much, but there's a delay period here as well. So initially, when the animal gets a reward with no CS, the firing rate of these dopaminergic neurons, which are recorded here in VTA, ventral tegmental area, go up a bit after the reward. After the animal learns that CS comes before US, the firing rate occurs after the CS, and the firing rate no longer increases at the US. If a reward is emitted, then there's a dip. So the animal is expecting a reward here, and the reward is emitted, then there's a dip in the spontaneous firing of this dopamine cell, which is supposed to be exactly like what you expect from this delta term in TD or from RPE. We'll get to it in a second. So in these cases, typically you don't think of the value being a table, but it's basically the value is some sum over some weighted sum with synaptic weights, WI, over the states, UI at time t. So notice, though, that in this experiment, the location of the animal or other aspects of the environment do not change. The only thing that changes is time. So what is the notion of state here that changes over time for the animal? So in the same paper, they suggested the following scheme, that when the animal sees this specific CS, or the specific unconditioned stimulus, conditioned stimulus, then there will be cells that fire responding to this conditional stimulus, be it a tone, an odor, a visual stimulus, but some cells will fire a unit time later, other cells will fire 2 unit times later or n times later. So the whole time between CS and US must be tiled with these temporal basis functions. These are called tap delay lines. So what does this really mean? It means that the value function at each time depends on these tap delay lines. So the value function just after it's calculated, just after the CS comes on, just after the conditioned stimulus comes on, depends on the cells that fire immediately after the CS. But the value function here depends on these cells that have a lag, these cells that take a time until they fire. This assumption actually, and this assumption doesn't need to be these clean cells, which are often called those complete zero compounds. It can be more complex temporal basis functions that spread out and are not as clean as these. But note, these tap delay lines or temporal basis functions must exist a priori before learning for this to work, and they must be different for different possible for different stimuli. Because if you are to learn that one tone versus another tone or an odor is what comes before the US, the set of temporal basis functions subserving it or being activated by it must be a different set than another one. So if you make this assumption, as Schultz and Diane and Montague have shown, the response, the delta term, or often called RPE, looks very much like what the dopamine cells do. So here is a simulation, a very simple simulation of TD0. In the beginning, in the first trial, the cells, the delta has this value at the time of the CS because the animal was not expecting any reward. So VS and VS prime were 0, so this delta was RS. And as the trials go by, this bump of activity moves to the time of reward. So the time of the CS is 200, the time of reward is 100, and then it stabilizes as a peak at the time of reward. So if we look at what this delta term is in the before learning, there's a bump at time of the US, and after learning, there's a bump only at the time of the CS, because before the tone comes, and the tone times is unexpected, or before the odor comes, there's no expectation of reward. Only when the CS comes, there's expectation of reward. So then it's fires. So this here, these two things here look very much like the delta before and after. So that from that came something that is very well accepted now in the neuroscience community, that dopamine neurons code for RPE. And by the way, in this perception, if suddenly there is no reward given, the expectation of reward will mismatch the actual reward, and there'll be a dip. So this also agrees with this data. So let's understand what the assumptions are. The assumptions basically for this to work in this kind of case is that every type of CS must have its own chain of temporal basis functions. And since we do not know when the reward should come, they should be at an arbitrary length. Maybe we should say animals will not learn it for more than a certain time. So they would need to be as long as the possible time that animals would learn. A weaker problem is that making such change is often not robust, but that's not a real serious problem. So not a fundamental problem. So the fundamental problem is that we don't know a priori which CSs will create a US and how long they should be. So it's not that the people were smart, and so some of them, at least, this is Sutton, one of the people developing TD, knew that this was they call it useful fiction. The second thing I'm going to say is that this these assumptions are inconsistent with the data. So experimental observations are inconsistent with TD models. So you might say, but people have found these basis functions. So this is in striatum, and this example, the US is a CS. The animal just gets, sorry, a US on a fixed time interval, but the fixed time interval could either be 12 seconds. This is from Mello et al. From the Patton Lab. And what you see is these basis functions, these are the responses of groups of cells that respond to different times. So say, but these basis functions do exist. What the experiment also shows, when you stretch the times, these basis functions stretch. So we see that they are plastic. What this experiment has not shown us is, do these basis functions exist before, which is essential for TD, before learning took place. This is another example. And by the way, we also don't know if they're specific to a certain CS or not, because there's only one CS here, which is the US. This is another example. I'm kind of have that much time to describe it, but this is from timing cells in hippocampus, and it shows these cells that are specific to order A or to order B, which tile time between the CS and US. This is also plastic. So if the time is stretched from 6 seconds to 8 seconds between CS and US, this whole set of cells that respond changes. It's not as nice in this striatum example that we had before. In this case, it kind of just randomly reshuffles which state mapped at which time. This paper has also shown that there are some, even though we don't know if they're stimulus-specific cells, before learning, but their number is much, much smaller. And their number grows when the animal learns the CS-US association. So here is how their numbers grow over days. And this number doesn't grow if the animals are just passive. That is, they're not in a task. This is what the second plot shows. So basically, both of these examples show that there might be temporal basis functions, but that they're plastic, and that there are many less of them a priori before learning happens. So, and the mapping is different. In the striatum case, they kind of stretch out. In the hippocampal case, they kind of randomly map. And also in the hippocampal case, they randomly map over days, even if nothing has changed in the task. So another objection could be the lack of a moving bump, which is something that TD0 shows. So TD0 has this moving bump. This is data from Pan et al., which shows that rather than the bump moving, a new response starts cropping up at the time of the CS, rather than a bump moving in time. Pan et al. Said this is an indication of TD lambda, which doesn't see this moving bump, which is kind of correct, or it sees much less of a moving bump. Recent results from Amo et al. From the Uchida lab claim here that there is a moving bump. I think it's not a very clear result here, but if you see these slow learners, you seem to see this bump moving, not in the faster or intermediate learners, it's not as clear. But other results, more recent results from Joing et al. Don't show this, so don't really know, but I don't think it's a fundamental problem really, because TD lambda does not have this moving bump. But another problem is that if you look at the RPE over iterations in TD, the total RPE, or the total delta, if gamma is 1, should stay flat. If gamma is smaller than the 1, that is a discount, actually the total integral of the RPE should drop. What is this experimentally? So if we go to this ammo paper and look at this integral of the RPE and look how it changes over time, we see that it actually does not stay fixed or does not shrink. It actually seems to transiently grow, then go back down, and these results seem to be statistically significant. So the growth here is very clear in any kind of method that it can look at. There's an initial transient growth. This is inconsistent with TD as well in terms of the data. There's new arguments from this Young paper that actually RPE cells don't represent RPE. I'm not going to talk about that. It's a different thing, because what I'm talking about here is not whether RPE exists or not, but given that RPE exists, how can we actually learn it? There are also theoretical arguments that question whether we really actually need to learn value. So what is the resolution? How can we solve this problem? We claim that in order to solve this problem, it's impossible to have a fixed basis function for every possible CS a priori. We claim that the temporal basis functions must be learned. So that's basically what this flex theory says, that the temporal basis functions must be learned. The flex theory itself doesn't say what they should look like. So they might look like these results in the striatum, where there are these bumps of activity. They might be cells that learn with a decaying transient activity, the duration between the CS and US. Or there might be more complex things like the type that a plastic RNN can generate. But all of them, including this one, must be plastic. That is, they must develop only for the CS-US association. So that's basically the claim. That's the hypothesis. The next thing I'm going to show you is kind of a proof of concept. I'm not going to claim that this is the way it's done in the brain, but what I'm going to show you that this can be done in a biophysically plausible way. So the network I'll describe has two components. One of them is this VTA-like component where we have dopaminergic cells and also inhibitory cells. But it connects to another component, which might be the prefrontal cortex or prefrontal cortex, maybe even the striatum. This is where the temporal basis functions are formed. And the type of temporal basis functions I will choose are of this form, the form that shows this decaying responses from the CS to the US. These responses are learned, as shown by these experiments in visual cortex, for instance. These are cells actually that don't decay but peak at the time of the expected US, but they're also shown in ventral medial orbitofrontal cortex and in prefrontal cortex. So these are shown for and are plastic in these cortical areas. And one of the reasons we're using these temporal basis functions is because we actually have worked for years on trying to explain how this works, so we know possible mechanisms for how they might learn. So this is original results in V1, and basically all we're claiming is that a recurrent network with excitatory recurrence can learn to go from a network that responds just during this time of the stimulus to a network that learns that is responsive from time to reward from the time of the stimulus to the reward, and decays over this time. And this is an example of a network that we've published before that learns both these sustained responses, these peak responses, also some responses that are decayed as exist in experimental observations. And so I'll briefly explain how this is done. There are two components to how this is done. First of all, this is the mean field theory of this spiking network. So in the mean field theory, what you see is that this is the synaptic conductance, which is a variable we're talking about here. So the synaptic conductance in this network has a source term, which comes from the recurrent connectivity. This is the source term. This is basically the firing rate of the cell given synaptic variable S and connectivity variable L, and this is a sync term. So if you look, this is the sync term, negative the sync term, this dashed line, and these curves are the source term for different values of L. So for small values of L, the source term is very small and the network decays quickly. For intermediate values of L, you see that the source term almost touches the sync term, so there's a bottleneck and the activity stays up and then decays. And this case is the case we know better. This is the bistable network where the source term crosses the sync term at 3 points. And just to show you another illustration of how this works, so in this movie we show how the synaptic variable changes over time. And here you're showing the value of S as a function of time, as a function of the value of the sync term, the source term, as a function of time for a larger connectivity matrix and a smaller connectivity matrix. So we see that we can tune the time that this network will decay by tuning the difference between the source term and the sync term. How do we learn this? So the first question is, how it's expressed? It's expressed via a recurrent network. How do we learn this? Well, we can learn this via basically reinforcement learning, but without this TD rule. Basically, we need to solve two problems. One is a temporal credit assignment problem, which we've had before. That is, how do we assign the reward that comes in the future with activity that's happening now? And the other is a stopping rule. How do we change this, stop this growth when it reaches the right value? And the way we do it now, in the beginning, is we use a rule that's based on two synaptic eligibility traces. So what are these eligibility traces? These eligibility traces are terms that grow in a Hebbian manner when a synapse is active, and it decays slowly, so that, and that only when reward comes, and this line here is reward, will it change into synaptic efficacy. So here we see two eligibility traces, one for LTP and one for LTD. They grow during the activity time of the network, and then they decay slowly. When the reward comes here, there's more LTP than LTD, so the weights grow. As a result, the network activity is prolonged because the weights grow, but still there's more LTP than LTD. Eventually, it will grow so much that, there are two assumptions here. I didn't say that. One is that the LTP trace decays slower than the LTD trace, and the other assumption that the LTP trace value here at peak is bigger than the LTD value. So eventually these two things cross and we have a fixed point. The learning stops. And we can use this to learn very many different, over a large range of decay times, here up to 2.5 seconds, which is kind of the maximal limit. I won't go into why now. The nice thing is that we have experimental observation that these two eligibility traces exist. They exist in V1, they exist in prefrontal cortex, and that the trace for the LTP is longer than the trace for LTD, as we assumed. So we can learn this using the two trace case, but when we couple these two things together, the prefrontal component learns these temporal basis functions. But what also happens is that these, and sorry, I didn't show you something. These temporal basis functions also generate these peak cells. And these peak cells exist because of a balance between excitation and inhibition. So this is the inhibition in the network. This is the excitation. The difference between these two generates these peak cells. So what happens here is that when learning occurs, three synapses change, three types of synapses. These recurrent connection synapses, which learn the temporal basis functions. The connections between the feed-forward connections between the CS synapses and the dopaminergic cells also learn, And they also learn according to this two-trace rule, so that when CS is active, and there's some spontaneous activity in the DA, it causes an eligibility trace to grow. And when dopamine is active, then it causes synapses to strengthen. So this explains the growth initially of the activity at the time of the US. And eventually, when these messenger cells come into place, the connection between the messenger cells in the PFC and the GABAergic cells in dopamine and the VTA grow, and this connection inhibits the activity of the dopaminergic cells in VTA. So here we have a circuit made of two components which can learn this, the dopaminergic responses exactly. If we emit a reward, we get a dip. And if we emit a reward for a long period of time, we get what's called extinction. We no longer have the response here at the time of US. Notice also actually that this did not change the PFC component. So it still has information about time, which means we get something called savings. The next time we learn it, it will be faster. Now, our network is a spiking network. So what I've shown you until now is just average responses over the cells, but there's a variability. So this is before learning. This is different cells in the population. This is during learning, and this is after learning. And you see there's a variability. Not all cells have their US response depressed. Not all cells learn the CS response, which is very similar to what's seen in the data. These are the dopaminergic cells, the one on the bottom, and non-dopaminergic cells. Another thing this network does is it shows that the integral, so notice here that before we depress the response at the time of the US, we learn the response at the time of the CS, which means the total integral first grows, and only when we start shrinking the response to CS does the integral shrink, which is qualitatively consistent with the experimental data. Our model can also reconcile other data that seem to be inconsistent with each other, our experimental data. So you can train this model with not one CS, but two CSs, one stimulus, another stimulus, and then a reward. And different experiments show different results. So Panadol claims that you get responses at these two CSs, whereas Schultz claims that you only get a response at the first CS, and you don't get a response at the intermediate CS. What does our network do? Our network originally learns two CSs, then depresses the second CS, but eventually it transfers the activity from the second CS to the first CS. So what we're claiming is these two results are probably correct, but these were done earlier in the process of learning. These were done later. So I know I rushed through some of that, but let me try and get to another point here. So one of the beautiful things about TD is that it's both a normative theory and a mechanistic theory. What do I mean by that? I mean, it gives us both a why and a how. And the why is we're trying to learn value. And the how is by using the TD algorithm. So you could ask with the algorithm we showed here, with the method we showed here, what is the why? I showed you a how, but what is normative interpretation of this? So I'm going about it the other way around, right? I'm not starting with a normative, I'm starting with a mechanistic, but asking, is there a meaning to this? So one possibility is that we're trying to associate so we're saying that the DA signal, or maybe other neuromodulator signal meaning. And the meaningful event in the beginning is the US. But after we learn the association, the meaningful event is the CS. And this meaning is important for learning in other parts of the cortex. So we need to get the neuromodulators to indicate meaning, and meaning needs to be learned because it transfers. In the beginning, meaning was just the US. Afterwards, meaning was transferred to the CS. And that is important for learning in other parts of the brain. And this part is not contradictory with this idea, that essential for learning, that maybe one of the main reasons for doing this is actually to learn the temporal basis functions. That the temporal basis functions themselves are important. So this whole dopaminergic response might be important for learning temporal basis functions. Another small comment I want to make is that a lot of the data out there does not look naively like TD. So there are many papers that have come out over the years where people look at data that doesn't look like TD, so they add all kinds of features to TD, and then the data look like this modified TD. And another question is, when does TD stop being TD? I'm not sure I have an answer for that one. So let's summarize. My main claim here is that a fixed temporal basis assumption is unreasonable. From first principles, we just cannot, for every possible stimulus in the world, have a set of fixed temporal basis functions that span an arbitrary amount of time. Another thing I'm showing you is that there is no evidence for a fixed temporal basis function that is specific to every possible stimulus we're showing. And those two assumptions are essential for the current implementations of TD. So we're offering a theoretical alternative, which is that the basis functions, the temporal basis functions, are themselves plastic and learned as a result of this whole CS-US association. This is the theory. This is a general theory. I've shown you a computational model, which I didn't really have time to explain very well. And the computational model is a proof of principle. But it really accounts for the data very well. We're not claiming that this isn't really necessarily the way the brain does it or the only way the brain does it. We're claiming that it's quite reasonable to assume that the brain could do this.